there's just so much.
You're listening to a Mamma Mia podcast.
Mamma Mia acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters this podcast was recorded on. It's a Friday afternoon in the small Victorian town of Faraday in October 1972, and the Howarth sisters are excited for the weekend. There's only 6 students at school today. The other 4 that make up the cohort at Faraday Primary are off with bad colds. It's chilly and wet outside, so their teacher, Miss Gibbs, has agreed to let them play musical chairs inside. They're having the best time, squealing, laughing, sliding on the floorboards, when suddenly the room goes still. As 10-year-old Robyn turns to the classroom door, she sees 2 men standing there. One of them's wearing a black covering on his face. The other has dark sunglasses and a hat. The taller man raises an enormous gun, aiming it directly at them. "Please, not us. Please, not us," their teacher says, shaking. She looks terrified, thinks Robyn. What's going on? "School's over for the day," one of the men replies. "Get in the van now." I'm Gemma Bath, and this is True Crime Conversations, a Mamma Mia podcast exploring the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them. Victorian plasterers and fathers themselves, Edwin John Eastwood, 21, and Robert Clyde Boland, who was in his mid-30s, planned the kidnapping for months. Their crime was described at the time as the gravest situation of its kind in the history of the Victorian police force and Australia's crime of the century. The men had dug a trench in remote bushland where they intended to bury their victims. After putting plaster over their mouths and chains around their bodies, the hole was to be covered by galvanised iron and dirt. Thankfully, they didn't get that far. But that doesn't mean that what 20-year-old primary school teacher Mary Gibbs and her 6 students endured wasn't terrifying. In her care were Christine Ellery, 10, sisters Linda Conn, 9 and Helen Conn, 6, and sisters Denise Howarth, 5, Gillian Howarth, 8 and Robyn Howarth, 10. While the event gained significant media attention at the time, the survivors have largely refrained from telling their stories publicly. Until now. More than 5 decades on, Robyn has released a book titled Faraday, A Community Rediscovered, in which she details what happened to her and her classmates. She hasn't felt comfortable sharing her story until now. Robyn, you published your book on your account of the Faraday kidnapping last year, more than 50 years after it happened. Why now?
I suppose, and I didn't realise myself till I started writing, but I'd carried a grief and a loss all my adult life about Faraday. And as an adult, I was always very reluctant to ever tell anyone where I came from, because whenever anyone mentioned Faraday, it was always in the context of, oh, I remember that. I remember that story. That's that place where those kids were taken. What awful history that place has. You know, every time we drive past the school, which is still standing, but it is a home now, I just shudder. Mm. And I remember thinking as I aged, and I hope get more reflective and maybe older and wiser, I always felt really sad about that, because Faraday, we were so much more than a kidnapping. We were a lovely little community and we loved our school. So I guess probably about 15 years ago, I had returned back to the area. Like, I had left that area as an 18-year-old, because I went nursing. And I'd left the area, I'd married, I'd changed my name. And I remember thinking, when I was living in the Goulburn Valley area, beautiful part of the world in Victoria, that I would never, ever have to tell anyone who I was and where I was from, because all through my adolescence and I guess late childhood, we were always referred to as, "You're one of those girls, aren't you? You're one of those girls." And I realised I was really tired of hearing that. We never, ever viewed ourselves as victims, never. But the press at the time certainly sensationalised the story and were not particularly kind or respectful. And that's a memory of a child when I look back. The school closed after the kidnapping. But when I, was writing the book and reflecting, I thought, oh, gosh, Mum, 3 young mums with two with toddlers turning up on that Friday afternoon to collect their children. The school's empty. They wait and then they go into the school and then they search the school grounds. Nothing, eerie silence. They cross over to a pine plantation opposite. They search there, nothing. And then they go in and eventually find a ransom note threatening the annihilation of every hostage if a ransom of $1 million wasn't paid. And myself and 2 little sisters were part of that actual crime. So Mum had 3 daughters. So for Mum, the trauma was really, really deep. She kept every scrapbook, every press article for years and the police crime photos, and she had given it to me, and I realised I had a treasure trove of information. So I decided, well, I was going to try and put something together. And then as I sort of started writing it, Gemma, I thought, I think it's actually a little bit bigger than just our family.
Well, a quick Google tells me that the population of Faraday in 2016 was 158 people.
Oh, wow, was that many? Many?
I was going to ask, is that a lot? What was it when you lived there?
Well, I think that is a lot. I would be guessing, but I would think in 1972 we'd be lucky to have 50 to 80. In 1972 we had 10 students at Faraday. That was huge, huge. Normally we only had, 7, and there was, I think, 5 families. And we had 2, families that had moved in who weren't the traditional farming families that had been there for generations. So we were so excited. 10 students, 10.
How does that work? How does 10 students in one school with one teacher work?
In reflection, I think it must have been very difficult, and but it did. You had the older students at the back, the younger students at the front, all being given, the appropriate work for the year level. But certainly joining a netball team or something was a bit tricky, wasn't it, really? Gemma, writing this book, which has been just amazing, and the response has just been so overwhelming and humbling, but so many people who come to the author talks all want to share their experience of the one teacher school, and apparently I capture that era very, very well. So having said that, it was a very safe, secure space, but I guess not a lot of outside influence either.
Because take me back to your life in the 70s. You said you were a farming family. You were also quite isolated. You didn't really leave the farm. You talk a lot about really wanting to go on holiday to the beach, but you couldn't because your dad couldn't leave the cows. Paint us a bit of a picture of what it was like growing up in Faraday in the 70s.
We were quite poor. So there wasn't a lot of money, but it was, I reflect back, it was a time of great ritual and routine. And so like every Thursday, so the furthest we ever went is we went into Castlemaine, and we would take Grandma Howarth, who lived in the farmhouse next to us, shopping every Thursday. Now, Grandma didn't drive, of course, so she would always come over the paddock, the dusty track, dressed in a hat and gloves and shoes and stockings and matching handbag and beads, even in 40-degree heat, to walk up and down the main street of Mostyn Street, nodding and smiling to all the other ladies that had come in off their farms. But, we kind of knew everyone and were probably related or connected to many. Sunday was very much, that traditional roast lamb and steamed ginger pudding, and we would go and visit our grandparents in Bendigo, and that's probably as far as we went. You know, we would spend time with our cousins. But our school was really important to us because that was essentially the hub of the community because we didn't have a hall.
Mm-hmm.
So gatherings, and not that they were huge, I might add, but any gatherings were held at the school. So it was a really important place for us to be.
So in 1972, the teacher was Mary Gibbs. She was only 20
Correct.
years old. What was her story? Why was she coming to Faraday?
I would imagine back then they had to apply for several schools. Look, I don't know, and obviously Faraday was allocated to her, but I do chuckle to myself now because I have very vivid memories because Miss Mary Gibbs was very stylish with lovely outfits, you know, and it was that era of the 70s, the boots, the short skirts, and I always remember the mums, you know, gathering at the school gate or after, you know, oh, I wonder what she's going to be wearing today. And the fathers were just horrified because this young woman would be driving backwards and forwards from Bendigo to Faraday, which is probably about 30 minutes, maybe back then was 45 minutes because the roads are pretty awful and the car's not as good, but they were really worried that she would have to have a chaperone go down and back with her because it would just be too much.
Oh, gosh. I mean, at least they were concerned for her welfare, but...
And they were trying to think about, you know, local accommodation for her, just, you know, to help her, you know. So I thought, oh, what a different world.
So in the September of 1972, your sister started noticing a couple of men kind of watching the school. Can you tell me about that?
Yeah, look, and I suppose that's the sister guilt I sort of carried too because she did. She was noticing, you know, and she mentioned it to me a couple of times. Oh, did you see those men today in the creek? And I you know, being the big sister, I kind of dismissed it because my head was full of, you know, we had to practice for the school sports that was coming up and the Castlemaine show was happening. So there was a lot of things on, but she did keep mentioning, oh, did you see those men today? And I didn't, but it was only, you know, of course, after the crime was committed that they had actually staked out the school and were well aware that there was a young female teacher and how many students there were. And you sort of look back and that does give you the shivers to think that they would do that or that they did that.
What do you remember of the morning of Friday, October 7 in 1972?
Look, I remember that well because it was a really cold morning, which was unseasonable. Mum has passed away now, but she was a very good mum, so she's trying to, you know, drag us all out of bed because it's freezing cold and, you know, we're having our cornflakes and our toast. And we used to often cook the toast on the open fire. And I remember having a big, well, not a big argument, but, you know, Mum had said, no, you're going to need long pants and jumpers today. So the little sisters all went and obediently put on what she'd put on. But I, of course, didn't and went to the wardrobe and got the most inappropriate summer dress I could find, a cardigan. And I really, later that day, I remember thinking, oh, I wish I had listened to Mum. And it was, you know, it was just really a very typical morning. There was nothing different except probably I had driven Mum demented with my dress choice.
So around the time that this all happened, you were saying it was a bit of a cold day, it was starting to rain, and instead of PE out in the yard like you normally would, you were inside and your teacher was playing musical chairs with you.
Yeah. Well, we had gone, it was, I think we were meant to have PE outside, but it was miserable. And October, which is a bit unusual in Victorian October, but yes, we were, which was really probably one of our most favourite things we like to do. We were really having fun.
When did it change? How did you notice the men and what did they do when they first came into the room?
They were just really still for a start. They were very still. And I guess, in the nightmares later on, like they were like giants looming, but I guess still. And we were really taken aback because remembering a little small rural school, we didn't really have visitors come to the school. And, they looked, a little 10-year-old girl probably couldn't process it properly, but you would have to say sinister.
Well, at least one of them had kind of a balaclava on.
Oh, the balaclava, and the other was in some sort of wig and hat pulled down and sunglasses, and the little girl does remember thinking, why would you wear sunglasses inside? That's an odd thing to do. And she remembers very clearly thinking, because of course it was Edward John Eastwood in the balaclava, and it was Robert Clyde Boland with a bag and in the wig and sunglasses and hat. But Edward John Eastwood had a 22 gauge rifle that he was waving around and aiming at children. And the little girl remembers thinking, wait till I get home and tell Dad. He is going to be so wild, because, of course, a farming family, we had guns, but we were never to touch the gun. It was always unloaded in a porch with the bullets well away from it. And the little one remembers thinking, that man's dad must have never told him how to manage a gun, because someone could get shot with what he's doing. It was that very innocent view of life.
Yeah. Were you scared when you saw them at first?
I think we were, yes. But it was possibly a little bit as if time had stood still, and it was bewilderment, I think.
You're listening to True Crime Conversations with me, Gemma Barth. I'm speaking with Robyn Howarth about the day she was kidnapped from the Faraday State School in 1972. Up next, Robyn describes how she felt being driven in the van by the men who had kidnapped her, not knowing where they were being taken. What did the next 10, 15 minutes look like? Because it really only took that amount of time to kind of get you guys from a classroom into a van and on the road.
Yeah, I think it took like 15 minutes or something to kidnap the whole school. And also remembering we were good little country kids. So, we're probably quite bewildered. It would have been so much worse for Mary Gibbs, because she would have had a lot more awareness of what was happening. But, they virtually charged in and, gun waving and sit on the seat, and you're quite puzzled. And then we were virtually marched out and loaded into the van with Eastwood. And I remember thinking, well, I don't want to go with him, but what was the option? And the teacher remained very calm, which was amazing. But so, oh no, we need to go out. But she remained back. She didn't come into the van till later. So we were there just with Edward John Eastwood, who we thought was quite nutty, really.
Well, you actually spoke to him, didn't you, as he was kind of loading you into the van? You asked him a question?
I did, because I had, and my school friends all tell me they did this too, so it makes me feel a lot better. I often snake out at night and watched, Homicide and D24. So I thought I was a bit of an expert on crime shows. So I remember saying to him, you're not going to murder us, are you? Robbing us would be okay, but not murder. And then, he looked at me as though I was a little insect on the floor. But then I remember thinking they wouldn't rob us because we've got nothing that they could take.
What did the back of the van look like?
It was virtually empty. I think there was a yellow petrol tin up the front. It smelt of petrol. It smelt of, it was just very basic, and we sat on the wheel, sort of lining seats each side. Yeah, very basic, empty.
And did they say anything else before they drove off? They threw your teacher in with you and basically just hit the road.
I think Robert Kybellen said something like, you need to be really careful. Eastwood must have got out at some stage. You need to be really careful of him. They almost were trying to play the good cop, bad cop sort of routine.
So one of them drove the van and then the other was in the back with you?
Yes, correct.
And that was Eastwood, the one that you thought was a bit crazy, who was kind of in the back with you?
Yeah. He was only 21 at the time.
What was the trip like? Was he talking to you or was he talking to Mary? What was happening in the back?
He talked all the time.
Really?
He talked all the time. And in the end, we were trying not to make any eye. And I think I wrote in the book that poor Miss Gibbs got the short straw because she was sitting quite close to him. And it was almost like he was trying to impress her, but he talked and talked and talked. And I remember in the end, we all just kind of thought, oh, well, it's my remembering. No eye contact and just trying to peer out of the little holes in the van to see where we were actually going. More so we could avoid talking to him, because you certainly got the sense that he wasn't really interested in talking to children. It was more he was trying to impress probably a very attractive 20-year-old young lady.
He was talking to you about the fact that you were going to be in the newspaper?
Yes, yeah, that we were going to be famous and they'd put us on the map. And then I think he had said to Miss Gibbs, Mary, at some stage that he'd send us some money in the mail, all this grandiose, and of course our world was so small. So we were thinking, well, maybe we'll get a paragraph in the Castlemaine Mail. Like that's our local newspaper. Oh. Or thinking, well, why would we be in the paper? And I remember, the little girl remember thinking, he is seriously crazy, this man. Why would he think we would be in the paper? Yeah.
You said he had a gun. Did he have any other weapons? Could you see anything else that looked a bit sinister?
Yeah, it was just a carry-on like bag, very nondescript, but it was full of chains and I believe a knife because. And this is really horrific that they had dug a trench out at Lansfield and they had planned to put us in there chained up with plaster tapes or something over our mouths. Now I don't know this, I can't know this, but I've always liked to have thought that they couldn't go through with it, because I think if they did that, there's no way we would have survived it.
Do you remember how you felt on that trip? Because it was a couple of hours, wasn't it?
Yeah, well, it felt, it actually was uncomfortable, sore bottoms, bumping up and down, scared, but also remembering too, Gemma, it was almost incomprehensible, really, to make sense of something that you really couldn't make sense of.
Well, you were only 10 and you were the oldest.
Yeah.
So it's 6 really small girls from an isolated community experiencing something that is just, very confusing, very strange. I can imagine that getting the concept.
I think too, though, Gemma, because, and I get this view has really crystallised since I've written the book, because we were from a rural community. We had been, dearly loved, dearly looked after all our childhood. So we were also good little country kids, and we did, none of us had a complete melt, and all kudos to Mary Gibbs. None of us had a complete meltdown because she didn't. But I guess we were used to, this is what we're doing now. There was none of us would have been mouthy little girls that would be arguing or, we did what we needed to do to survive it, I think.
There was one moment where Mary kind of faltered a bit and she did start crying. Do you remember that? Because Eastwood whispered to her, and in hindsight you now know that he was telling her about the trench.
Mm.
But in that moment she that stoic, strong facade that she was putting on kind of crumbled, didn't it?
Mm. But then I remember too, he sort of reached over and said, no, you've got to think of them.
Oh, but it's your plan. So he was telling her to be strong even though he was threatening her.
Yes, yeah. That probably goes to his mindset too, really, all over the shop, really.
Tell me about the money he stole from Mary and how shocked you were by that.
Oh, yes. And we were so offended and upset for her. He wanted to see her licence because we didn't know that at the time, but he had a plan of how he was going to collect the ransom off the state government. So he wanted her licence to prove that he had it. So she gave it to us. And then he said, well, have you got any cash? And she said, well, $9, and gave him that. And, he's holding his hand out for the money, and we're looking at each other in horror going, he's just stolen $9 from that teacher. He's a thief. But she had another, $26 hidden somewhere else that she didn't give him. And after, we learnt that, not at the time. And I always remember my dad saying, oh, good on her.
So they drove you to kind of a remote area near Lancefield. What was it like there? Like when he stopped the van and they opened the back doors and let you out to, have a wee. You'd been travelling for a few hours. What did you see? What was it like?
It was very, remembering it, and I in my mind I've probably recreated it more than what it was, but it was miserable, very overcast. It was really thick bushland. It was an area, of course, we didn't know. We didn't know where we were. The thought of escaping certainly didn't occur to me, because where would we have gone? It was a frightening place, actually. And Lancefield is a beautiful part in rural Victoria. It's beautiful, but I do write in my book, as a maternal and child health nurse, I have done some work down there, and it's a beautiful community. It's a beautiful area. And but I remembered, with maternal and child health, we always do a home visit after a family has a little baby. And if I ever had a visit booked at Lancefield, my heart would just sink going back to Lancefield. And I realised why that was, because my memory of it was a frightening place, really.
Well, what did that afternoon look like for you and the other kids? Because it was, 3:30, 4 o'clock you arrived. What did you do?
Well, first of all, we, scampered round and had a wee, and then I think we sort of stood around, and then, we had this treasure hunt that we thought was hideous, because at that stage Eastwood had left to organise the ransom, so we were only being guarded by Boland. So I guess, too, you were sort of thinking, oh, that's good, one's gone, we've only got one here, and he didn't talk as much. So that was a good thing, but it was miserable, really. It was just miserable. And then he locked us back in the van, which I guess was a relief, really.
When did your families realise you were missing?
Probably about, 3:34, when they went to collect, when the mums went to collect us, and they found the ransom note. So it was on that Friday.
And what did the ransom note say? Not everything, but there was, particular phrases in there that really kind of affected your mum and the other mums.
Oh, yes, it was virtually, that we had been kidnapped, and they were demanding $1 million from the state government, and if their demands weren't met, it would result in the annihilation of all the hostages.
Annihilation?
Yeah.
How did your mum feel reading that?
Apparently, they had decided to loosely base the crime on the Clint Eastwood movie Dirty Harry, was some of their motivation, or how they planned it out. So I've never watched that movie, and I don't plan to.
I know you said your mum was a really stoic woman, but did she tell you about how she felt that afternoon?
Oh, it had affected Mum greatly, but she didn't really ever talk about it a great deal, ever. And she found the press interest very stressful.
So it's the 70s. There's no mobiles. These three mums arrive at the school to pick up their kids. They're not there. They have this ransom note. What did they do? How did they kind of raise the alarm?
One of them ran over to a neighbour to get a call to the Castlemaine police, and it was probably actually around the same time Eastwood had called Wayne Grant, a reporter with the Herald. Now, he was very lovely. He was very, very kind to us. And he thought for a start it was a crank call, but then he looked up where Faraday was and thought, I need to sort of call this in. And he, I think he called D24, and I think the Castlemaine police had just got the call, and all of a sudden there was a realisation that something really very bad had gone down. And then the mums all drove back to their respective farms to scramble around to try and find their husband, because we're all farming and the men are all out working wherever. Again, no mobile phones or anything to sort of raise the alarm.
So the police, they mobilised pretty quickly. 200 police,
yes,
200 volunteers, and all the locals.
It was huge.
Tell me about the search.
The search was huge, when I reflect back. So Castlemaine virtually went into an emergency lockdown because there were police, flooded in everywhere. All your service clubs were there, the CFA, I think St John's, and as the story broke, as it was being broadcast over the radios, people leaving for weekends or going away stopped the direction they were going and headed to the school and joined the search. So it was a massive search underway. And then, of course, all the farmers, and that's what people talk of today, how they all, in that area, huge, just searched and walked their properties everywhere. Like they just searched and searched and searched. But it was hopeless. Like it really was hopeless.
Was delivering the ransom ever going to be an issue? Because, all the bigwigs got called in very quickly. We've got the heads of the police, we've got the Premier. Was getting that money together going to be hard, or was that just, yes, we're doing it?
My understanding, and look, I can't say this for certain, but my understanding was that the government were going to find the money, and I think they borrowed it from a company. And there's a very iconic photo of Lindsay Thompson, who was the Deputy Premier and Education Minister at the time, because they wanted him to be the one to deliver the money, and standing at Woodend, which is a little town outside of Melbourne in the early hours of the morning, because there was a call came through for the ransom to be delivered. Now, whether there's two thoughts. One was that it was a hoax, one that it was the kidnappers. Anyway, the police surrounded Woodend. They had the Deputy Premier standing in the main street with a satchel. Whether it had the money, I don't know. And the police commissioner, he wasn't the police commissioner at the time, Mick Miller and Mr Crawley, who ended up being the assistant commissioner, were in an unmarked car, fully armed. But they were really concerned because they thought there was a good chance that the Deputy Premier would be shot, because they just thought whoever was doing this was absolute madman.
So they think that might have been a hoax call?
Yeah, they do. Well, they did. No one turned up. No one turned up to collect. And I think there's an interview with Eastwood where he became aware of that and sort of made some comment, some other bastard was trying to get in on the caper. And the police actually said, well, you should know, you made the call, and it wasn't me. So now who knows, really.
Let's go back to Lancefield and this kind of rural bush area that you're all standing in, because the part that gets to me is thinking of it starting to get dark and all these little girls that are used to being tucked into bed.
Oh, absolutely.
Having their bath, having their dinner.
Yeah.
What did bedtime or nighttime look like in Lancefield that night?
Well, it really wasn't a bedtime or a nighttime, and again, this is bizarre sort of stuff, because it was freezing in the back of the van, and Robert Clive Bowl, and then we all moved into the front cabin and huddled together for warmth. But I remember us all sort of getting in there and, leaning as far away as we could because no one wanted to sit near him for warmth. And Denise, the little one, like she was only 5 and a tiny little girl, had to sit on his knee, and she said her memories are of just a scratchy jumper. But, and him continually, the story had broken and him continually fiddling with the radio and turning it from channel to channel because the press kept telling the story of that tragic story of Graham Thorne, the little boy that had been kidnapped and murdered.
So they were telling Graham's story as a comparison to you guys?
Virtually, yes. There's been a kidnapping. The last known kidnapping was in Sydney of Graham. He was murdered.
And you're hearing that on the radio?
There's grave fears for the, and he kept turning it from channel to channel to, and sort of almost fumbling, I guess, and then turned it off, I think. And then he turned to us and said, I really love kids. And even as a little 10-year-old girl, mentally I remember thinking, no, you don't.
Well, wasn't he a father himself?
He was, and I think to similar age children.
Did they give you anything to eat?
When Eastwood returned, we got cold chips, I think it was. Yeah. But I can't remember us drinking much or, that memory's a bit blurry. Yeah, no, not really.
And at some point during the evening, they both left, didn't they? Together?
Yes, they left.
And what did you do? Did you get any sleep? Were you still in the back of the van or in the cab?
We must have got a little bit, but also to remembering, we were good little country kids. We did what we were told, and they very said, now you stay here, we'll be back in the morning. Don't move.
Mm-hmm.
I'm in awe of the bravery of Mary Gibbs because, they had clearly said they were coming back. We had no reason to doubt that wouldn't happen. Luckily, we didn't listen to them.
Tell me about what Mary did. How did she get you out?
I think we must have had some sleep and, it's daybreak or it's daylight, and she probably became aware too that we couldn't just stay in here forever. We hadn't had anything to drink, needed to go to the toilet. And, she started just sort of tapping around to see, and then she, eyed off this panel at the back and remembering it was that era of those beautiful boots and the miniskirt and started kicking and kicking and kicking and kicking. And one of the girls, Christine, was a really good, she could hold the chain well, she could lean on her. I didn't think I was that helpful. I tried to hold it at times. We took turns or tried to kick, but it was really Mary in those boots that...
So she literally kicked a panel out of the van?
Yep, out of the back van, yes.
This 20-year-old woman with these big sturdy boots.
And remembering we had been told, you do not move. We are coming back, do not move.
So she got you out. You all kind of stumble out of the van. What did you do? Were you terrified?
Yeah, and actually I think that was probably the most frightening parts of it because it was very much, if they come back they're going to be so wild because we haven't done what they said we had to stay still. But again, we started walking out and, she had said we needed to be very quiet and just follow her, and if we heard anything we had to run and hide, which we did. And it was only when we started hearing gunshots that we went, oh no, and we all really hid, and so did Mary Gibbs. But then she heard something that we didn't, and she stood up and beckoned for us to stay where we were and went towards the sound because she had heard women's voices.
And it wasn't the kidnappers, it was...
And there were a party of 4, two men and 2 women. I think they were having a weekend away rabbit shooting.
So it wasn't the kidnappers, it was this kind of group of friends?
Friends, yeah, that had were obviously knew this area and had come out early, or maybe they'd stayed over, I don't know, but they were rabbit shooting, and that she heard the gunshots, but once she heard the women's voice, she realised it wasn't the kidnappers.
I can only imagine from their point of view watching these 6 dirty, bedraggled children and a teacher kind of stumbling out of the bush. That must have been very strange.
They were very shocked and very taken aback, but I remember they were very kind. I suppose they were quite fearful for their safety too, so we all piled into their car and ended up at the Lansville police station.
Tell me about the miscommunication that happened once you arrived there, because to paint the picture, once again, it's a country town. So there is a police station, but it's manned by 1-2 police officers, and there's a house.
The policeman wasn't there. He was out, possibly on patrol. So it was Mrs. Anderson, this tiny, tiny lady, and, they pulled up, and one of them must have gone in and said something innocently like, "I've got the teacher and the children in the car." And with that, Mrs. Anderson stormed out and was just furious and started yelling at the rescuers, virtually saying to them, how could you do this? And I remember that one of the gentlemen saying, "Well, we actually thought we were being helpful."
And Mrs. Anderson was the police officer's wife.
And I remember her yelling at them saying, "Helpful? You call this helpful?" And Mary was able to explain, no, these aren't the perpetrators, this is the rescuers. And then Mrs. Anderson calmed down and then called out to her son, "Oh, you can stop, you can put the gun down." Now, her son, I don't know how old her son was, but whether he was a young adult or a late adolescent, had a gun trained on the car. He was going to shoot the tyres out if they tried to hit from a bedroom window or something like that. And then I remember she was very kind, was very, clucked over us and wiped our faces and gave us some hot Milo. And yeah.
So pretty quickly the police and the media were surrounding that house and that police station. What was that like? That would have been your first kind of instance seeing a media kind of horde.
It was surreal, and it wasn't particularly comfortable. My memory, because the police had arrived. I think Mr. Thompson had arrived. Like it was a really big deal, and then the press had all set up. And I remember one of them saying, "Well, it's best if you go out. They want photos. But I don't think anything could really prepare. Well, it couldn't prepare us for that because we had no experience of a press throng all yelling out and all. And the other thing, Gemma, it didn't resonate till I wrote the book. It was all men.
The journalists.
It's all men. Back in that era, it was all men.
And they were kind of yelling questions at you, weren't they?
Yeah, it was quite sort of intrusive. At the time, that's what it felt like anyway, it was.
Do you remember being reunited with your parents? How long after the rescue was that?
It's been a few hours because it would have, there was a lot going on at Lansfield, maybe late morning, maybe lunchtime. I remember it being really excited, being driven back to Castlemaine in a police car. And they bought us an ice cream, and I remember thinking, oh, we never have ice cream in the morning. This is, and but then again, when we got back to Castlemaine, just an enormous crowd outside the Castlemaine police station. And so they virtually had to usher us through the people, the crowd to get in the building to reunite with our parents.
And how did they react? Do you remember their reactions?
Oh, Mum was incredibly distressed, and Dad, poor old Dad, that was the era to never show any emotion. And I remember seeing him marching up and down as if he was a soldier at the back of the room. And I remember thinking to myself, "Dad, you weren't in the army. Why are you marching?" And then he walked up to us to shake our hands. And then he burst into tears and hugged us all.
Oh, bless. He shook your hands.
Yeah.
What was the rest of that weekend like for you?
It was surreal. It was a surreal weekend. press were because we lived on the Calder Highway. I think it was probably had easier access to us maybe than the other families. I'm not really sure about that. And remembering rural people, if someone comes to visit, you invite them in, you give them a cup of tea, you might have afternoon tea for them. So the press kind of were just there in every room. They seemed to just be there, really. And family, lots of visitors, which was really unusual. And I tell you probably won't think it's very funny, Gemma, but when I thought back, I thought it was funny because I'm at Richmond Tragic with the AFL, and I got back and it was that afternoon the VFL grand final was on, and my hair's matted and my fingernails are filthy and I'd scun my knee and I was really grotty and dirty. Instead of having a bath, I stood there being annoyed with all these journalists wandering around because I wanted to listen to the football grand final, and it was Richmond and Carlton won. And I remember thinking, can the weekend get any more worse? Really?
At that point, it had just happened. Do you think you were feeling traumatised when you look back, or were you kind of it was all just shocking?
I think it was just an avalanche of experiences that we could never have anticipated, ever. So at that stage it was sort of like you're in the middle of a tsunami, really.
We now know a lot more about the men. At the time, obviously you didn't. You were 10, but you have done your research as an adult. Can you tell me about them? What do we know about them? How did they meet? How did they come up with this plan?
Yeah, look, and more people at these author talks come and tell me lots of little gems about the perpetrator. My understanding is that Eastwood, he was a 21-year-old from Melbourne, had already started embarking on a life of crime. Robert Clive Boland was from a very well-respected, established family in Bendigo, and never really got a sense of why. Well, he wanted money, but they met at a plastering course and decided they both wanted an easier life, and this would be a good way to net $1 million. Now, my understanding is Robert Clive Boland was the mastermind and Edward John Eastwood was a very eager pupil. That's my understanding.
After the break, Robyn shares a chilling moment when the identities of the kidnappers were revealed, and surprisingly, her mother recognised one of them. That night when they both left the van, was that actually them abandoning the plan altogether?
Gemma, that's an interesting question. And one thing Eastwood did say when he had been arrested and had been interviewed, and he did say something like, there must have been a lot of people praying for those little kids that night because everything just went wrong for us. But I'm glad they weren't hurt.
So maybe they chickened out?
Jim, look, I don't know. They had their plan loosely based on the Dirty Harry movie. So Eastwood had driven to Melbourne and he'd already been round where he'd put Melways in phone boxes. So they had decided to make contact with a priest at the Tally-Ho Boys Home in Melbourne, and he was going to be their, go-to person who was going to go to phone box to phone books, follow the clues and the government, and I think Mr Thompson were to deliver the ransom to this priest because they thought a priest would be very reliable. And when he phoned the Tally-Ho Boys Home to speak to the father, he was on annual leave. And so then I guess he probably did panic, and then he phoned D24 to talk to Mr Thompson and I think panicked and hung up. And so I think they went back to regroup and leave us there. Now, I really don't know what would have happened if we hadn't have escaped, whether they would have come back because it was very isolated where we were. And really, when you think about it, a very wicked thing to do.
Oh, it's horrific. Well, by the Sunday, the police had offered a 50K reward for answers. They were obviously tracking these two men, and they did get a bit of a lead. Someone kind of gave them the names, and both of them were arrested at their respective homes, so Melbourne and Bendigo, at about 4:30 a.m. on Monday.
Correct.
And Eastwood actually kind of confessed straight away, didn't he?
Correct. Yes, correct. Reg Baker was the lead detective. He went on to be the Assistant Commissioner of Police. He was just the most wonderful man, and Reg was very kind and shared his memoirs with me, and he had, written his memoirs on stories that had, on cases he'd worked on that had really affected him, and the Faraday kidnapping was one. But I didn't know this, but he told me that his interview with Edward John Eastwood was used as a teaching tool for many years to come with police on how to interview and how to get as much information as you can.
Wow. And when their identities were revealed, your mum recognised one of them.
Yes, she did. That was Robert Clive Boland.
And she was related?
Yes, she was. And that has caused for my family such distress over many years.
It was quite a distant connection though, wasn't it?
Yeah, well, yeah, yes and no. So it turned out that my grandfather and Robert Clive Boland's grandmother were brother and sister. My grandfather was, back then one of those big families. We didn't know or have any relationship with the Boland family apart from knew who they were, but it wasn't nice. It wasn't nice. Yeah. And it was particularly distressing for my maternal grandparents living in Bendigo. And look, I must say I do need to make this comment, and I've only sort of realised myself as an adult that, and I do want to acknowledge, is that the Boland family were very well respected family in Bendigo. They were business people, and Robert Clive Boland's actions really damaged their reputation. And, I know some of the Boland actually relatives, nearly lost their businesses because there was such ill feeling towards the Boland name, and I think that's unfair.
Mm. You had to go to a police lineup to identify them.
Yeah.
What was that like?
That was really horrific. Yeah, that was really, I think that was wrong that we had to do it like that, walking into a room with all these men lined up against the wall. And back then they looked like they were giants. Of course they weren't. But again, and the police bringing you in, all men, so you're one little girl surrounded by men.
So you weren't in between, like in the movies, you're behind glass.
No.
You were in the room with them?
Yeah, no.
Oh, that's scary.
And lined up at the back and then at the side and then just one over at the other side, yeah.
You had to give evidence in court. Initially, despite the confession, they both kind of pled not guilty, which meant 2 trials or a trial for both men, and you had to give evidence. Firstly, how much of a big deal was it for your family to make that trek to Melbourne?
Oh, Gemma, that was a nightmare. So Dad would prepare. So we actually had to testify four times because there was the hearing, and then there ended up being 3 Supreme Court cases. Initially, they did both plead not guilty, but then Edward John Eastwood did plead guilty, so then it was only the Robert Clive Boland one. Just drive, and people in Melbourne may not realise that, but people in the bush, driving to Melbourne was just horrific. And so Dad would look at the Melways for 3 days, he'd stress, he'd be muttering to himself. And we always did the same thing every time. We drove down, we parked at the Royal Children's Hospital and we caught a tram in, but we would stand at the tram stop with Dad muttering and swearing because, of course, you never asked anyone which tram to catch. I think it's an Australian man thing. We never ask directions when we're going somewhere. So that for us was yeah, a big thing, very big thing.
And what was it like standing up in court? Because by this point you would have been, 11? This was 1973?
Yeah, probably 10, 11, yeah. No, and again, and I do talk about it in my book, that I did develop like a post-traumatic stress disorder, and I think the appearance at court was probably the huge triggers for that, because you're a young girl, you're in a totally foreign environment. Your dad's already lost his mind trying to drive to Melbourne, so it's already stress levels a little bit high. You're in a packed court gallery, because there was huge interest in this case. Packed gallery, press everywhere, the judiciary everywhere, and, they just all look so learned and superior, I guess. And they're all men. And then you've got the perpetrator. At the start it was two, but then it just being one. But they're sort of standing directly opposite you, up on a bit of a stand, looking down at you. So it was an exceptionally intimidating space to be in.
So Eastwood was pretty quickly given 15 years with a non-parole period of 10 years. As you've said, Boland pled not guilty and ended up having 3 trials.
Yes.
And you think that there might have been a bit of funny business going on there?
He had an excellent defence. With 2 hung juries. I think one of the hung juries was, like, at that stage had the record for the longest deliberation.
Yeah, 19 hours.
Yeah. The third trial, however, though, and, I do write about this in the book, because the police were getting exceptionally disheartened because they felt they had a very strong case, which they did. They had eyewitnesses, they had fingerprints, they really did. But
didn't they think that there was jury tampering?
We never knew that. But it was always rumoured that
it was just speculation.
Yeah, speculation, I suppose, because it just didn't make any sense that there was no clear conviction. But in the third trial, Gemma, there was a huge change to the Crimes Act, where up until that time, a crime against children, like kidnapping, a wife was not compelled to give evidence against her husband and disclose marital conversations. Now, my husband, David, was a police prosecutor for many years, and he was telling me that the Faraday kidnapping case with the trial of Robert Clyde Boland was famous for police prosecutors, because at that time the Crimes Act was changed, and crimes such as kidnapping and incest were changed so that then a wife, it was normally a wife, could then be put on the stand and cross-examined regarding marital conversations. Up until that time, David had said to me it was really difficult getting convictions when children were being involved. So that the Crimes Act was changed, and Robert Clyde Boland's wife, Lois, was compelled to take the stand in the third trial and disclosed marital conversations. And the jury in that case took 30 minutes to reach. So it was a real game changer.
What did she say?
It was virtually repeating that he had admitted that he'd done it. That he'd done it. He knew now where he'd gone wrong. He'd done it, and also he'd given an alibi that he had been in Melbourne that day, and she virtually dismantled his alibi.
She also alleged other violence, other crimes.
Well, towards herself. Like, when I read the appeal document, I was really shocked. I was really shocked by this, that the defence just crucified her on the stand and she collapsed. But it was clear when I was reading the information that she was terrified of him. Like, it appeared to me anyway that she was a victim of family violence.
Mm. So that third trial, he was found guilty, sentenced to 16 years with a minimum of 12.
Yes.
But as you said, that's 3 trials that you as a young girl, as an 11-year-old, had to deal with in 1 year.
Yes, yeah, and my family were always very upset about that. You know, they just, if he had have just pleaded guilty, we could have moved on a lot quicker.
A few months after the kidnapping, you actually went back to Lancefield and saw the trench that we've been talking about.
Probably not one of my father's
Why?
finer parenting moments.
Yeah. Why? Why did he take you there?
I think at the time, Dad had developed quite a nice friendship with the Constable Anderson that was there. So Constable Anderson must have invited him to go back, and because we never went anywhere, we said, "Oh, Dad, can we come too?" And we huffed and puffed and thought, "Oh, well, yes, you can come too." So we went there, and then, you know, I think Constable Anderson must have said, "Well, do you want to see where they were held?" "Oh, yes, yes." So then we went out there, and then I think they did say, you know, "Just wait here," and he took Dad off to see the trench. But of course, I don't think I listened, and I followed, and I wish I never had, really, because that memory was etched really there.
Do you think that visit in particular caused a lot of trauma for you?
Yeah, I think it sort of probably compounded the nightmares a little bit, yes.
Can you tell me about the mental impact as a child that this had on you? Looking back, at the time, you know, in the 70s, it wasn't really spoken about, was it?
I suppose it's only as an adult you sort of look back and I guess reflect. I remember thinking as a child, you know, the press interest was so great, and that went on for years. So it really dogged us for a long time. And I remember thinking, I guess that survivor guilt, Gemma, a little bit, thinking, oh, why have I survived but other children haven't? I'm not particularly gifted or brilliant, I don't believe. The press were always making us out to be victims. We didn't see ourselves as victims. Probably embarrassed by the press interest. And I think we all look back, adolescence is an awful time at the best of times, but sort of trying to navigate your way through that. And I know for me, when I reached 18 and moved away from the Castlemaine area, it was actually a big relief to be out of that area and not maybe associated with Faraday.
The decision was also made pretty quickly after the kidnapping to close your school. What impact did that have?
Probably didn't realise it at the time, but as school closed and then we, you know, went to Harcourt, which was a little bit bigger, and you don't realise it at the time, but we did. We lost our hub, we lost our place to meet, our place to be, and Gemma, we lost our stories because after 1972, the only story told was that of the Faraday kidnapping. So in many ways, we lost who we were before that. We lost our stories. And our stories aren't particularly newsworthy or fascinating, but they were our stories. They were real and they were who we were. And I guess writing this book virtually, and I know everyone is fascinated by the Faraday kidnapping, but what has brought me great joy is it's taken me back to our life before that and who we were then, and wanting to actually reclaim those memories and be proud.
Obviously, the kidnappers went to jail for a long time, but kind of helped you move on hearing that both of them at different times actually escaped prison.
How bizarre was that? Like, these weren't minor offenders. These were serious offenders. They both escaped from different prisons, and Edward John Eastwood went on to kidnap another school at Warreen. And I've just actually finished an author talk down in the Gippsland area, and it was a wonderful experience. But the distress still there in some of those communities of that event is still palpable.
You went on to become a nurse.
Yes, I did.
You're now a maternal health nurse.
Yeah.
You're a mum of 3.
Yes.
You moved away from Faraday. How did the kidnapping follow you into adulthood, even though you'd moved away?
It's probably always been with me. And I guess, you know, for many, many years I ran away from my past. And, you know, when I was married to my first husband, I had a different name, a different area I lived in. And I remember thinking, I never, ever, ever have to say who I am and where I come from, unless I choose to. And then, when that marriage ended, reverted back to my maiden name. And I think even then I was starting to reclaim who I was. As a maternal and child health nurse, it's been an absolute privilege working with families and particularly mums. And I guess because of my experience, I became very unwell after I had my third baby in my 30s with postnatal depression, maternal exhaustion, and a post-traumatic stress disorder. So I'd been having horrific nightmares since I was probably 14, and always the same, nightmares, a knife coming towards me or a gun or a man in a balaclava. So I was finally forced to seek counselling and assistance, remembering, I was brought up in that era where you get on, you don't talk about it, you just deal with what life throws at you and you move on. And maybe not a bad way, but maybe not the best way. So with my clinical practice, I think over the years, every now and then I would see it was usually a mum that for whatever reason would be really struggling with their motherhood journey. They would love their babies dearly, but you could see there was something really not right. And I would often hope that I had the empathy to say to them, look, I can see you're really troubled about something. Is there something maybe that happened in your childhood that's really impacting on how you want to mother? And often, I just feel so grateful when people felt that they could share their stories with me, that, something would come out like, yes, I was a victim of crime, or I have experienced family violence or child abuse as a young child, and it's really impacting on me now. And it often does after you have a little baby. So, I've often been able to say, I was able to say, please find your voice, don't stop talking, and get some good skilled counselling, because if you don't, it will keep rearing its head and really impacting on your life, because I know that's what happened to me. And I don't share my stories, of course, and when people actually keep talking to me and go off and get counselling, that always has given me a great deal of satisfaction to think that maybe I've played a little small part in someone's journey to healing.
No, that's really nice, really beautiful. I understand that, and I can so imagine why this would have been hard, that sending your eldest child to primary school was a really kind of troubling moment for you.
Yes, it really triggered me. I had a new baby and I sent my oldest, a little girl at 5, to primary school, and it was not a good time for me. It really did trigger. It sent me back into a very dark, dark place. It did.
How has writing your story after all these years helped you?
It's taken me on a journey, and it's actually led me home to Faraday, which is I almost feel like I've come full circle. It's been wonderful to meet up with so many people from my past, people I've worked with, family members, dotted all over Victoria, who have all come to author talks. And we share our stories now about, the farm and grandma, and my sisters and I, we're talking about our school days, and we've never done that. We've never done that. So it's been an amazing journey, Gemma, and unexpected that there has been so much interest really in the book.
It sounds like it's allowed you to kind of reclaim Faraday.
And I must say, I said, I'm really nervous about doing this podcast, because I don't particularly enjoy talking about the kidnapping. I'll be really honest. I don't enjoy talking about it. But what I do enjoy talking about is I enjoy talking about Faraday. I enjoy talking about our school. I enjoy talking about our life. And so I feel like, yes, I've reclaimed it and I've reframed the narrative. Anyway, for me, anyway.
Thank Thanks to Robyn for telling us her story. True Crime Conversations is a Mamamia podcast hosted and produced by me, Gemma Barth, and Tali Blackman, with audio design by Jacob Round. Thanks so much for listening. I'll be back next week with another True Crime Conversation.